Welcome to the second section of Chapter 4, and in this one we're looking at the Minoans. As always, please make sure you're keeping the themes and subjects of the chapter handy, and you're referring back to it, you're making sure you understand, you're putting notes in there, because these are pretty much the guiding principles and the guiding ideas of the chapter. I have the timeline here just as again a check into where we are in our history. And so we're looking at Minoan art, and specifically we're looking at the New Palace period, which began about 1700 BC. Now there was an older palace period which was around 2000 BC, but the period that we're focused on begins around 1700 BC. Alright, let's do some background. First of all, find yourself on the map. You can see the red arrow clearly pointing to the island of Crete, which is where we are going to be for the next few bits of time in terms of understanding the Minoans. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Minoans did have an old palace period, which did begin around 2000 BC. And one of their scripts, called Linear A, was actually something that appeared around this time. Now, unfortunately, this old palace period came to a really abrupt end in 1700 BC, around that time, because of an earthquake that destroyed a lot of things. But the Minoans jumped right back up, and we have the era that historians now call the New Palace period, or the Middle and Late Minoan period, which began about 1700 BC. Now, this is often considered the golden age of the Minoans, and this is actually when historians consider the first great Western civilization. Now, before we knew anything about the Aegean cultures, we believed that the Greeks were the first great Western civ. But in this case, with our new discoveries in the last century, we've now reassessed that. And so Western civilization begins, generally considered at least, with the Minoans. Now, they're a seafaring culture, so there's lots of trade. Trade is so important to their lives. And in fact, Crete had trading contacts with Egypt, with the Near East, and with mainland Greece. So you can see it's a very strategic location, giving it access to these really other primary thriving cultures and civilizations. Now, it also had a powerful fleet of ships. So, because they became skilled seafarers, they developed this powerful fleet as well. And all of this, obviously, will attribute to their power and prosperity. Now that is, as our historians, when we look back at this, right, that's why we're able to have these grand palaces with their massive staircases and ingenious ideas about the plumbing system and so on, right? Because there is prosperity, there is power, there is ability to do this, and we're going to see that in the sections coming up. We've already seen this quotation before, an excerpt from Homer's Odyssey, where Crete is mentioned and Knossos is mentioned as one of the mighty cities. I just want to bring it up again because thanks to archaeology, right, all of these things that Homer's written down, we realized, there might have been a figment of fact that gave rise to some of these stories, that these places that he mentions are in fact real places. And the gentleman who gave us this information was actually Sir Arthur Evans. He was an Englishman, and in around 1900s, actually, he uncovers the palace at Knossos. And he says that it resembles a maze, it resembles the story about King Minos and the Minotaur that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, Sir Arthur Evans also attempts to create a chronology for Minoan art, and he's not exact, but it's a really good one that historians have with which they work. Now, Sir Arthur Evans also finds some really important tablets, such as these. And the script on these, right? So now we have a culture that's writing things down. And we have two sets, and this is just arbitrarily called Linear A and Linear B, because the line is emphasized, as you can see. The top one in this image here, Linear A, is actually undeciphered, which means we don't know what it says. But Linear B has actually been deciphered. Actually, it was 1952 by an English scholar. And he said that it's actually an early version of Greek. Okay, so he's the one who was able to figure that one out. But Linear A, we don't know. Some suggest that it might have origins in Phoenicia, which is present-day Lebanon. Others suggest that it might be related to language from Asia Minor. But again, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. But still, people are working on it. They're trying to decipher it. But thanks to the deciphering of Linear B, we do have some names and areas and things that have been mentioned. And this is the beautiful, mighty palace at Knossos that Sir Arthur Evans found. So we're looking at what's pretty much remains of it today, right? Now, but here's the thing. When Sir Arthur Evans found this, he reconceived it and reconstructed much of it between 1900 and 1932 when he was working on the site. Now, the original building, the original builders had actually used, framed walls with timbers. They had used rubble masonry, mud brick, ashlar masonry, and so on. Yet when Sir Arthur Evans reconstructed it, he tried to restore it, he was doing it with concrete. Now, this is something modern archaeologists began to condemn because they said, well, the Minoans didn't use concrete, so why would Sir Arthur Evans reconstruct it with that? How do we know it's accurate, right? All these issues come up in terms of reconstruction and whether it's a good thing to do or not a good thing to do, right? So here you can see it from another angle with some of these reconstructed sections of it. Now he reconstructed it based on the remains that were found, as well as depictions of architecture in Minoan paintings and sculpture. But there's always, room for error, and then there's always the question of, do we even do that, right? Do we restore a building or reconstruct a building that has history marked on it, right? Or do we leave it as it is? And this is a really big question, and I want you guys to think about, where do you stand on that? What would you say? Yes, we restore and reconstruct, but why, right? Or no, we shouldn't, but why, right? You want to know where you stand and be able to articulate that as well. One of the things to consider in that engagement with the idea of restoration or not is that now in our digital age we're actually able to use technology to reconstruct these sites. So you're looking at what historians have done in terms of what this Palace of Knossos looked like in its first day, right, in its completed moment. Pretty stunning. But question, and now think about that question, right? Do we restore physically when we can restore it digitally, right? Do we do that to the site when we can actually recreate it in this kind of digital format? Let's look a little bit more in detail at the Palace of Knossos. So there were 1,400 rooms. Okay, that's like a small town, right? You can kind of imagine this, and all kinds of functions. You'll see the image in just a second. But the really important thing here is that there are no fortifications around the palace. So, we've seen the Assyrian citadels, right? Heavy, thick walls around it. In a little bit, you'll see the Mycenaean citadels, again, heavy, thick walls around it. But when a place does not have exterior fortifications, such as here at Palace of Knossos, we basically think about it that there is no imminent danger of an enemy. In other words, there's no kind of fear of invasion and attack, right? Now we know that they have water all around it, so clearly defended against kind of enemy attacks, but also a powerful fleet of ships in case, something did happen. But really important to think about when you're looking at a site, okay? You're exploring it for what it looks like in the interior sections, but also notice if there is or is not a wall around it. Now, going on, the Palace of Knossos also was a center of control for the surrounding area. It was kind of like an administrative central location, right? And the Minoan elite lived around the palace, so kind of a nice area in this case. But when you look at the palace, and we're going to look at it more carefully in detail in just a few slides coming up, but 3 innovations to keep in mind, and this is my last bullet on the screen here. There are areas as high as 4 stories. So some of the terraces, especially on the east wing, are as high as 4 stories. Now this is amazing. You want to think about how do they get the light to the lowest levels, and I'll show you in just a bit. Number 2, the palace had a grand staircase that was supported by wooden frames. That's pretty stellar. And number 3, how they mastered light, right? So the light wells and the windows were on a scale that we've never seen before. The way they've created it is that the light could infiltrate all the way to the lowest level. So we'll just see that in just a second. But these are the innovations of the Minoans when it came to their grand structures. This is the general grand plan. Now, it is this image that I'm including is a little bit different than the newest edition books have, but I like this one because it has more of the details about where things are located, such as a grand staircase, which is number 12, for example, or the light well, which is 13, because some of the details are actually missing in the newer edition grand plans. And you know how I like to mark up images, and it's something I always recommend to students as well. So here it is, the image marked up. You can see the official ceremonial rooms. You can see where the workers' quarters and the servants' quarters would have been, where the living quarters were, you know, where the family would have slept, the reception halls, the hall of the double axes, which is going to be significant for us, the grand staircase that I already pointed out, storage rooms on the left side there, and an area up in the top left that we call the theater because it looks like it had some seats for spectators, but we're not exactly sure what they would have called it or how they would have used it, but at least that's how it appears to us. Now let's look at the palace as a whole, and then we're going to go into the different sections right now. Here you have the staircase with the inverted columns. And you're looking at the walls and things. I want you to see how it's made of rubble. Basically mud brick faced with some cut finished local stone is what they would have done. The timber is used for the columns. You can see it's heavier on top and then kind of more slender on the bottom because basically the tree has been put upside down, as we could call it. The timber is used to frame it, as you can see all around it. And those innovations that I mentioned earlier about, you know, being several stories, or the grand staircase being supported by wooden frames, and then even the light, right, the mastery of light, some of these light wells that allow the light to filter down into the lower levels is also something that's visible here. On the right side, you also see what would be called the throne room. This is the stairwell in the residential quarter of the palace, right? And you can see again the very typical Minoan columns, the staircase itself, kind of the material that it's made of, but just absolutely stunning and extremely impressive. Here we have the typical Minoan columns, again, right? Wider at the top, narrower at the bottom, right? In this case, we believe that they were actually cedar wood that was used here, kind of with that more bulby, cushion-like capital at the very top of it, and then the smooth shaft into kind of a narrower, more slender lower portion of it. And then, of course, they would paint them red, and the capitals will be painted black. This is a drawing of the throne room, and when Sir Arthur Evans found it, he actually said this was the oldest throne in Europe. At least that's how he explained it. And when he wrote back a telegram to the king, that's how he was describing it. But it's basically got a kind of a continuous bench along the wall, and then the throne is sitting right there. And on either side of the throne are these kind of fantastical creatures, or might also be griffins on the sides, to act as a protection of the throne. Now, again, this is kind of a designation by Sir Arthur Evans. We don't know how this room would have been used. So he's basically looking at the structure and the paintings and the form of the chair, and he is calling it a throne room. And this one is the Queen's Megaron, right? The Queen's reception hall. At least, again, this is what we have called it. We don't know how they would have used it. But here's a drawing of it, and you can see some dolphins, and there's a fresco in the top left portion. And then here's the room on the other, kind of tilted a little bit to the left, and you can see the dolphin fresco that's up on the wall there. And of course, you'll see a lot of marine life, nature, all of these included in Minoan imagery because that was what they knew, right? That's part of their world around them. And so a lot of their frescoes, which are basically paintings done on the wall, but they use a natural plaster. So it's kind of a wet fresco. It's painted with a wet plaster. Those are visible, and its nature imagery is quite predominant in these areas. And this is the hall of the double axes, which has a kind of the painted shields on the wall there. And the black and white photo is actually the arrows pointing to the symbol of the double axe that appears quite frequently in the entire palace complex. One of the features of the Knossos Palace is its plumbing system. It had fine bathrooms, good plumbing, and an effective sewage system. Now, what's interesting is today there's a tendency to judge other cultures based on the plumbing and the level of sanitation. Now, this is what we do when we find a new culture and try to understand it and kind of its level of development. And so in this case with Knossos, fine bathrooms, lots of terracotta bathtubs as you see here in the image, effective plumbing. So it was efficient and very well used. And one of the historians actually calls it one of the world's first toilets. These are the storerooms, and you can see those huge jars and the holes where they would have been put in. Now, these were used for the storage of wine, grain, oil, and honey. And if you can imagine, we've been told that these storerooms could hold about 20,000 gallons of olive oil. That's a lot of olive oil, but it also gives you a sense about how large and massive these areas were. Let's look at the story of King Minos and the Minotaur. So, and I've got the main characters there on the right. King Minos lives in Knossos, and he's struggling to rule. He's struggling against his brothers. He asks Poseidon, who's the god of the seas, he asks him for a sign of approval. Well, the god of the seas, Poseidon, sends him a bull. And King Minos, though, needs to sacrifice it back to Poseidon as an offering, as an act of subservience, as a gift of gratitude. But what does he do instead? He covets the bull, doesn't want to give it back. Well, you never anger the gods, right? So Poseidon is furious. What does he do instead? Well, he sends a curse onto the bull to rape his wife, King Minos' wife. Some will say that he puts a curse on the wife to fall in love with the bull, or the bull seduce the wife. Whatever the case may be, King Minos' wife and the bull have relations together. And the result of that is a minotaur. And you have an image of a half man, half bull up in that right mosaic up there. Well, after that, the Minotaur is kept in the kind of a dungeonous area of the palace, kind of what we call now a labyrinth, right? And every year, 7 young men, 7 young virgins or maidens had to be sent from Athens to Knossos to be fed to the Minotaur. Right? Now, what's interesting is historically at this time, Athens was subject to Crete. So there is that historical bit of truth that's there, mixing in with these stories that they've heard. And Sir Arthur Evans knew these stories as well, which is why he calls this people that he discovers the Minoans, based on this story. But let's continue. So, Athens is subject to Crete. Now, the Athenians finally send a hero, Theseus. Well, he will become a hero, Theseus. And he comes in, he falls in love with the king's daughter, Ariadne. Ariadne doesn't want to lose Theseus to the Minotaur, so she gives him a string, a kind of twine, that he can unwind as he goes in and then find his way back out after he slays the Minotaur, which he does. And so right then and there, the subjugation of Athens to Knossos ends. And we also have our story. So with the slaying of the Minotaur, we also have the end of Athenians being subject to those of Crete. Pretty interesting story. And so all of these come together in the mosaics and the ideas that are reflected in the palace here with the Minoans. I want to introduce a word here, leberis. You see the spelling up there. And this is Greek for double axe or double-edged axe, which is also what you're seeing up there. Now, this motif is seen throughout the palace, as you can see there on the right, all throughout the palace and its architectural decoration. And we believe it's referring to sacrificial slaughter, right? I mean, we think that's probably why it's there. Now, the Greeks later referred to this as the labyrinth, right, meaning house of the double axes. Right, that's what it's called in legends. The Palace of Knossos is called the House of the Double Axes. However, over time, the word has taken on the meaning of maze because the palace's layout is so complicated, right, that it eventually came to mean, so labyrinth eventually came to mean maze and became part of the Minotaur legend. But just want to introduce the word because it is significant in terms of our study of the Minoans and looking at the palace and the significance of the symbol of the bull, as we're going to see. Here is one part of the palace where you see the symbolism, right? The horns of the bull also represented here. So you want to try to think about, okay, references to the double axe, references to the bull, what is going on? Now, what does the symbolism of the bull represent? Why is it there? Well, we don't really exactly know. Some suggest masculinity, power. Maybe the bull was a sacred animal on the island of Crete. Maybe it refers to sacrifices, but somehow there is definitely an importance that's associated with the symbol of the bull. Another reference to the bull, as we're trying to kind of engage what it means, is this fresco, the bull leaping fresco from inside the palace, from the palace walls. Now, what you have here are three individuals. Now, the man is represented in the reddish color, and the women are represented in the light color. And this becomes a Minoan convention, actually, kind of an ancient convention of using colors to decode if it's a man or a woman that's represented. Well, you have one woman holding the horns of the bull, and the other one standing on the far right ready to catch the individual who's jumping. And the young man pretty much jumps up into the air, does a somersault, is going to land on the back of the bull, and then jump off into the arms of the woman there, kind of where she's there to help him, steady that bounce back onto the ground. Now, the bull is represented very powerful, very fierce, and kind of this charge and power that's conveyed. And mostly that's done because of this elongated shape and these very strong lines. And you can see that all of its legs are off the ground. So it's a leaping bull. And that even kind of activates the image even more, right? This individual is jumping on top of this bull and jumping off of it while the bull is in motion. So this kind of liveliness to the scene, the spontaneous nature of it, this action, dynamism, and motion, those are very characteristic of Minoan artwork. And the line, right? You see emphasis on the use of line and kind of how all these forms have been outlined here. That's one of the aspects that enables you to create this kind of active and lively and spontaneous form. Now, in terms of what bull leaping represents, we're still trying to kind of figure that out. And here's a drawing actually done by historians of what they believe happened, right? So the individual grabs the horns, the bull moves its head, right, kind of responds to that, grabbing of the horns, is flipped up, lands on the back of the bull, and then jumps off. So this is an activity, obviously very, very dangerous, right? But certainly something that they engaged in because we have frescoes and references to it quite significantly. One of the reasons this fresco is so important for us is because it does reveal the typical Minoan characteristics. So first of all, the typical Minoan figure that you're seeing on the right, which is an enlarged version, obviously, of the fresco itself. These figures are portrayed with long arms and long legs, okay, and muscular legs. You can kind of see the heavier thighs there. Very narrow, pinched waists. Their hair is long, flowing kind of braids or curls. They're portrayed in a profile pose with a frontal eye. You've seen this convention in Egypt as well as Mesopotamia, right? The figures are proud, they're animated, they're confident, right? So all of these kind of the features of the figure that's represented with Minoan art. Now, other things in terms of general characteristics, the outline of the forms, right? You see it with the bull, you see it with the individuals, the curving lines, lots of curving lines, not as straight edge as we've seen in Egypt, right? And we believe that these curving lines add to the idea of these like moving, elastic, lively beings, right? As you can see in the left with the fresco, often these are decorated, with borders that are pretty intricate and detailed. A lot of dynamism and action, lots of movement in these scenes, and quite a number of frescoes. I mean, they loved frescoes, paint with wet plaster right directly on the walls, which we see all over the Palace of Knossos. Now, before we consider why they might have done this, a couple of points here. We believe that these would have been taking place in the theatrical area of the palace, where I pointed out earlier when we looked at the ground plan, because there are remains of a fence there that we believe were meant to protect the spectators. And now thinking about why they would have done this, so several possibilities that several scholars give us. It could have been an initiation or a fertility ritual. It could have been a way to sacrifice people, or even kind of a spectator sport, maybe an early form of bullfighting. So whether it was a ritual or a sport, all of that remains unclear. We still need to find maybe more information. Maybe there are documents we haven't discovered yet that can shed light on this. But for now, these are the three suggestions we have about why they would have done this activity, very dangerous activity, right? And some suggest that maybe if they drug the bull, it would have been a bit easier, but I don't know. I still think it was pretty risky and pretty dangerous. What's fascinating about these bull leaping frescoes is that similar versions in the same Minoan style have been found in other places. So, a palace at Avaris in the Egyptian Delta, as you see here, this is a drawing of it. There are some in present day Israel, another one in northern Syria. We've also noticed bull jumping images appearing on the Syrian seals. So, we think, okay, what is going on? Like, how is it that it's taken into these different areas? Well, historians believe that it's most likely traveling Minoan artists. Okay, so they might have been traveling and in areas where the rulers thought it was fashionable to decorate their homes in this, or their palaces, I should say, in the Minoan style. That's probably what happened. Or it might be that there is intermarriage, and we know this because in one instance, an Egyptian ruler marries a Minoan princess. So could it be that the princess wanted decoration just like she had back home in her palace, wanted it in her new palace? Very likely. Another suggestion is that there might have been a group of traders, Minoan traders, who were going around living in different parts of the world, like Egypt, and they want decoration that they're familiar with, right? And you guys think about that. When, if your parents or grandparents are from other countries, they've probably brought their style and their taste in furniture and paintings and different things, right? So that's the same idea here, is that the style, this preference for Minoan imagery is taken up elsewhere because of traveling artists or traveling traders, or even princesses intermarrying and so on. But very intriguing, because these are not isolated cultures that we're looking at. They're very much connected to one another. Well, frescoes appeared elsewhere as well. Now, here's an example that's actually in a house, not a palace, as we've been looking at. And this is actually on the island of Tira, Akrotiri, as you can see, indicated by the yellow arrow in the map. Well, you might be asking, hold on a second, isn't that part of the Cyclades Islands? We've already looked at that. Yes. However, historians believe that at this time we're looking at, the island of Tyr was probably kind of an outpost of Minoan culture. They might have been linked politically, but definitely artistically. So it is grouped as Minoan art because it is very much like the Minoan works that we have seen. Now, before I tell you a little bit about the work, I want you to look at it and allow your eye to go from the left to the right and think about how is your eye looking at the work. Okay, do you notice your eye going up and down the cliff, up and down the cliff, and then here and there kind of jolting out with those lilies that are kind of springing out of the rock, right? And the way we want to describe that is the word undulating. I have the word on the screen down there in the red. Undulating, right? This kind of motion of your eye up and down, kind of swerving here and there. It's a very animated work. It's very much Minoan, right? We've talked about Minoans having dynamism and action and motion in their work. What else do we see here? It's a very free composition, right? It's not realistic, certainly. I mean, the lilies will not be the size of, or half the size of these rocky cliffs, right? But these cliffs are vividly colored, bright. The lilies are swaying in the breeze. You've got the birds, the swallows in the air. It's a very lively scene. So here's the thing, you guys. This is a landscape. I mean, the subject of the work is a landscape, pure and simple. No humans involved. Okay, we haven't really seen something like this, that the landscape is the only thing that's depicted, the landscape as the most important part of the subject. Now, the artist here, as you've gotten a sense of, he wasn't trying to give you a realistic landscape, right? He was trying to give you the essence, the feeling, the use of senses, right? You can see it, you can practically hear it, you might even be able to smell it, right? And the joy that brings about, we believe that that's what the artist was trying to do, and this is found in a home. So think about the experience of the people living here surrounded by this kind of imagery. And so Minoans, you guys, I hope you're getting this. It's a celebration of life. It's a celebration of beauty, of nature, and of this life, right? We talked about the Egyptians a lot about the afterlife and the focus on the afterlife, but here you have the Minoans really enjoying and embracing this life, right? And all of its beauty and all of nature and all this kind of lively heartbeat of life. All right, another work that I love is this marine style octopus flask. Now, you guys, first of all, this is a utilitarian object, which means it was used. It was a jug for water. Okay, you can see the handles and the little mouth. This is a jug for water. The other word I want to use to describe it is horror vacui. Okay, now this is an important term because in philosophy it actually means this theory by Aristotle that nature fears empty space, right? So tendency of gases and liquids moving into unoccupied places, right? That's horror vacui. But in art history we use it to refer to the style that covers the entire surface of the work. It's design, ornamentation, details, repeated lines, patterns, whatever it is. So that's clearly one of the features of this jar, okay, of this flask here. But look at the subject. It's an octopus, right? So the tentacles of it are reaching out all over it, kind of curving all over surfaces, embracing the curves, and really creating kind of this active, moving animal, this creature. You guys think about how deep in the water they must have been to be able to experience this. Even the little suckers of the tentacles are also obvious here, right? So here's the deal. Shape and decoration, or form and subject. The artist, the creator of this vessel, has to really think about the relationship between what the vessel looks like, right, its shape or its form, and the decoration or the subject that's depicted on it. So the beautiful curves of the tentacles and the suctions and the eyes, right, all these kind of circular motions truly reflected in the flask itself, right? Look at the curved handles, right? The curved tentacles and the jar's kind of big bulby belly, right? And then the curvy lines of this octopus. So really merging the idea of shape and decoration, or form and subject. Beautifully done. Looking at this other vessel, this is called the harvester vase. Now, again, shape and decoration, right? Form and function and object and subject all coming together here. So first of all, it's a rhyton. That's what it's called. It's a vessel used for pouring liquid. So again, another utilitarian object. Now, we believe that this one may have been covered with gold leaf, which means hammered gold, kind of sheets of hammered gold. It's only 5 inches in diameter, you guys. So do that with your hands. That's pretty small. Okay, so it's a pretty small surface area that they're working with. And you can see that the bottom part of it has not survived. So we've kind of just got the upper portion that we're looking at here. Here's an enlarged section of it so you can see it a bit more closely. So what do you think they're doing? What are these harvesters and sowers doing? Are they going to the field, or are they coming back from the field? Well, most of us believe that they're actually coming back from the field. They're bursting with energy, right? There's motion and liveliness to the scene. Your eye kind of dances around it into the forms, right? You can see their mouths are open. They're singing. They're energetic. This is so Minoan, right? This animated scene. They're marching back. We don't know if it's a procession of some sort, if it was an official festival that was happening, or if it's just like another day at work. We're not really sure, right? But instead of kind of an orderly, rigid, group of people marching, you've got this animated group in motion and kind of diversity among them. And here you can see more of the piece, right, kind of around the object and what's going on. And the individual in the top right that you see, kind of the one that's singing most fiercely, he's actually holding what's called a sistrum. You've got the word up there. It's a rattle-like percussion instrument. You guys, so there's music in this scene. So just like the spring fresco that we saw, you can hear it and feel it and experience it, right? This is so typical of the Minoans. They're doing this all the time, right? This beauty of expressing, being alive and celebration of life and nature, all of that coming together in this harvester vase. All right, a couple more points to make here. First of all, can you guess how many people are around this object? There are 27 men that are depicted, and look how cleverly the artist has done that, right? You can see the kind of part of their profile, those big kind of extended chests that are singing. Now, one other point here that's so important, you guys, is the idea of studying the musculature, right? Studying the human body. You see that with the individual in the foreground here, in the front of this group, right? With the ribs showing. His muscles are, his biceps and arm muscles are all showing. His chest is so full extended that you can see the ribs forming. Well, when we study the Greeks, you guys, we know they were obsessed with the human body. And if these cultures were the predecessors to the Greeks, Could it be that that interest in the human body and really understanding and depicting musculature, could it be that it has its roots here and then it got further and further developed into the Greeks? Well, we're going to explore that much more, obviously, in chapter 5. And one final point about form and decoration, right? Shape and decoration. The way they've done this work is they've got the people in a procession all around it. So you move very rhythmically around the object as you would experience this procession, right? This kind of joyful return from the field at a successful day, right? At a efficient efficient work. But again, one of my favorite works, but so much about the liveliness of it that I think captures our attention here. The end of the Minoan period around 1200 BC. Scholars have disputed what really happened in the end, so none of us really know for sure. What we do know is that in 1628 BC there was a major climactic event, something that created really big disruptions in the weather. Now we believe that would probably be the volcanic eruption on the island of Tira. Now, what happens when a volcano erupts? Some of the results of that, first of all, the trade would be impacted, even on the Minoan Crete, right? Tsunamis would have battered the Minoan coast, destroying a lot of the villages and a lot of the boats in the harbor. Also, as a result of all this, because of the sulfur dioxide that comes into the air, the climate changes, the temperature changes, so we have many summers of ruined harvest. So all of these, we believe, led to the slow decline of the Minoan culture. Now, around 1450 BC, and some historians kind of give and take a few years there, we believe that the Mycenaeans kind of made their appearance on the island, moved onto the island, and possibly just took control of the palaces. Now, around this time, we also know, that a lot of the palaces were destroyed, and historians still do not say for certain if it was the Mycenaeans who caused the destruction. Even if they weren't the ones who caused the destruction, they certainly benefited from that because they were there for a little bit longer, kind of ruling in that area. And then the final destruction of these palaces and kind of Minoan life as we've studied it is given to us as a date of 1200 BC. Again, nothing is for certain, a lot of gaps in our understanding. But what I'd like you guys to know, though, is first of all that there was an eruption, a volcanic eruption that would have impacted Minoan Crete as well because it is so close to the island of Tira, as you can see on the map, right? Second of all, that the Mycenaeans did move onto Crete. Some even call it conquering Crete, but certainly, taking over, maybe even governing from some of the palaces. But other palaces were just destroyed completely. Now, what caused that destruction? What would have been the impact of that? Some of this stuff is still unknown. But we do want to kind of go forward from here and shift our gear to the Mycenaeans on the mainland to study that culture there and kind of what was going on. And that'll be the last segment of chapter 4 for you.